Evan had spent 6 years convincing himself that the past was behind him, until he saw the locket. A small silver heart, glinting under the fading sunlight, hanging around the neck of a little girl with golden hair and familiar blue eyes. His world tilted as realization crashed over him. He knew that locket. Because years ago, he had given one exactly like it to Selena. Evan Sterling had spent the last 6 years convincing himself that the life he had built was enough. His company was thriving, his wealth continued to grow, and he had everything a man could want, except the one thing he had never let himself admit he needed. He had buried himself in work, in success, in control. It was easier that way. It kept him from thinking about the past, about what he had lost, about the woman who had disappeared from his life without a word. That evening, after another long day at the office, he decided to take a walk through the park near his penthouse. He rarely did things like this, but something about the stillness of the early evening, the sound of distant laughter, and the rustling leaves made him slow his pace. He wasn't sure why, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe. That was when he saw them. 2 little girls were playing near the fountain, their blonde hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. They looked identical, moving in perfect sync as they laughed and twirled in their dresses. Evan wasn't one to notice children, but something about them made him pause. There was something familiar in the way they carried themselves, in the way their bright blue eyes sparkled when they smiled. Then one of them turned toward him, and he saw it. A silver heart-shaped locket hung around her neck, glinting in the fading sunlight. His entire body froze. He knew that locket. Years ago, he had given an identical one to Selena. It had been a simple gift, a small token of his affection, but she had treasured it. She had worn it every day. His heart pounded in his chest as he took an unconscious step forward. The girls hadn't noticed him, too caught up in their game, but then a woman's voice called out to them from a nearby bench. "Lily, Sophie, it's time to go." Evan turned toward the voice, and his breath caught in his throat. Sitting on the bench, watching the girls with careful eyes, was Selena. She looked different, her once long hair now shorter, her face a little more tired, but there was no mistaking her. It was her. She was here. Alive. And with her were 2 little girls who looked exactly like him. The world around him blurred. 6 years. 6 years of silence, of believing she was gone, of trying to move on. And now, here she was, sitting only a few feet away with 2 daughters who had his eyes, his golden hair. His mind raced with questions, with disbelief, with anger. She had never told him. She had never given him the chance to know. Selena must have sensed his gaze because she looked up. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. Shock flickered across her face, followed by something else, fear, hesitation, guilt. She knew. She knew that he had seen. She knew that there was no running from this. Evan took another step forward, his hands clenched at his sides, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. "Selena," he said, his voice low, controlled, but filled with the storm raging inside him. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Evan." His name on her lips after all these years sent a surge of emotions through him, pain, anger, longing. The girls turned toward their mother, confused by the sudden tension in the air. And just like that, his entire world changed. He had spent 6 years believing he was alone. But he wasn't. Not anymore. Selena looked like she wanted to run. Evan could see it in the way her fingers twitched slightly, in the way her breath hitched just enough for him to notice. But she didn't move. She just sat there, gripping the edge of the bench as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Evan took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The emotions surging through him were impossible to contain, anger, disbelief, confusion. But underneath it all was something deeper, something more painful. Betrayal. For 6 years, he had lived his life believing that Selina was gone, that whatever they had once shared was over. He had searched for her at first, desperate for an explanation, but after a while, he had forced himself to stop. He had convinced himself that she had left because she wanted to, that she had chosen to disappear from his world. And now he stood here, staring at two little girls who looked just like him, and he realized the truth. She hadn't just left. She had taken something from him. Mom. One of the girls, Lily, if he had heard correctly, looked up at Selina with innocent confusion. Who's that? Selina swallowed hard, her eyes darting between Evan and her daughters. Her voice trembled slightly, and then she let out a slow breath. He's an old friend. The words sliced through him. An old friend? That was what he was to her now. Evan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to do this here. Not in front of the girls. But Selina must have sensed his thoughts because she stood abruptly, glancing toward the girls. Why don't you two go play for a little while longer? Her voice was gentle but firm, and after a brief hesitation, the girls nodded and ran back toward the fountain. Evan barely waited for them to be out of earshot before he spoke. An old friend? His voice was low, controlled, but he knew she could hear the sharp edge of emotion beneath it. Selina pressed her lips together, looking away. What was I supposed to say, Evan? He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. How about the truth? How about telling them who I actually am? She flinched. Just for a second, but he saw it. Evan stepped closer, lowering his voice. Are they mine? Selina closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. She didn't look away this time. Yes. The single word hit him harder than he had expected. He had already known, how could he not, when the resemblance was so obvious? But hearing it out loud, having her confirm it, made it real in a way that left him breathless. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. How could you not tell me? Selina exhaled slowly. Evan, not here. Please. He looked over at the girls. Lily was splashing water at Sophie, and they both erupted into giggles. They had no idea that the man standing only a few feet away was their father. Something about that thought made his stomach twist. He turned back to Selina. Then where? She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of paper. She scribbled something onto it and held it out to him. Meet me here in an hour. Evan took the paper without looking at it. His eyes remained locked on hers. You don't get to walk away from this, Selina. His voice was quiet but firm. Not this time. Selina nodded, and for the first time since he had seen her, she looked as broken as he felt. I know. Without another word, she turned and walked back to the girls, taking each of their hands in hers. She led them away, their blonde hair shining in the evening light, their laughter still lingering in the air. Evan watched them go, gripping the piece of paper so tightly that it crumpled in his palm. 6 years. 6 years of missing out on their lives. And now, he was going to find out why. Evan arrived at the address Selina had given him exactly an hour later. It was a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, far from the towering skyscrapers and high-end restaurants he was used to. The place had a warm, inviting atmosphere, the kind that made people feel at home. But Evan wasn't here for comfort. As he stepped inside, his eyes immediately found her. Selina was sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on the window as if she was lost in thought. For a moment, he hesitated, watching her. She looked different than he remembered. The years had softened her, but they had also left their mark. There was something tired in her expression, something that hadn't been there before. He wondered if she saw the same thing in him. Taking a deep breath, he walked over and slid into the seat across from her. Selina glanced up, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. You came, she said quietly. Evan let out a dry chuckle. Did you think I wouldn't? She exhaled, looking down at her coffee. I don't know what I expected. He studied her for a moment, then placed his hands on the table, leaning slightly forward. Start talking, Selena. No more excuses. No more avoiding. I need to know why. She swallowed hard, then slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. I was scared. Evan's jaw tightened. Of what? Of me? She shook her head. No. Of what telling you would mean. Of what it would do to you. To us. His fingers curled slightly against the table. You don't get to decide that for me. I know, she whispered. I know that now. Silence stretched between them, heavy and filled with all the things that had been left unsaid for 6 years. Finally, Selena let out a slow breath and straightened her shoulders. I found out I was pregnant after we broke up, she began, her voice steady but soft. I thought about telling you. I really did. But at the time, you were, she hesitated, searching for the right words. Evan already knew what she wanted to say. Consumed. Ruthless. Obsessed with his career. She didn't have to say it. He had been all of those things back then, and he had lost her because of it. I thought if I told you, you'd feel obligated, she continued. That you'd push yourself into being a father when you weren't ready. And I didn't want that for them. Evan clenched his jaw. You didn't even give me the chance to try. Selena's face softened, and for the first time, there was real regret in her eyes. I know, she admitted. And I'll never be able to take that back. Evan sat back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent years thinking she had walked away because she didn't love him enough to stay. He had never considered that she had left because she was trying to protect something. But it didn't make it hurt any less. His eyes met hers again. So what now? Selena hesitated, then glanced toward the window. I don't know, she admitted. But I do know one thing. They deserve to know who you are. Something inside him shifted at those words. For 6 years, he had been living in a world where family wasn't something he thought about, where his past was something he had buried. But now, he had 2 daughters. And no matter what had happened before, he wasn't going to let them grow up without knowing him. I want to meet them, he said firmly. Selena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. It wasn't a perfect answer. It wasn't an instant solution. But it was a start. The next day, Evan stood outside a modest suburban house, staring at the front door. His heart pounded harder than it had in any boardroom, any negotiation, any high-stakes deal. He had faced ruthless competitors, made split-second decisions worth millions, and built an empire from the ground up. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Selena had given him the address and a time to come by, and now that he was here, he wasn't sure how to move his feet forward. It wasn't fear of rejection that held him back, it was the weight of what this moment meant. He was about to meet his daughters. Daughters he should have known from the moment they were born. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. A few seconds passed before the door opened, and there they were. Lily and Sophie stood side by side, their identical blue eyes wide with curiosity. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Their golden blonde hair framed their delicate features, their small hands gripping the edge of the doorway as they peered up at him. Selena appeared behind them, offering a small, reassuring smile. Girls, this is Evan. They didn't react right away. Lily tilted her head slightly, studying him with a seriousness that seemed far too mature for a 5-year-old. Sophie shifted her weight, glancing between him and her mother. Evan cleared his throat, suddenly feeling uncertain about what to say. He had never been one to struggle with words, but now, standing before these 2 small strangers who were somehow his, he felt lost. Hi, he finally said, his voice softer than he expected. Sophie was the first to respond. Hi. Lily was still watching him, her little brows furrowed. Mom said you knew her before. Selina gave her a gentle look. That's right, sweetheart. Lily looked at Evan again. Then why haven't we seen you before? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of how to explain something so complicated to a child. Selina knelt down beside them, placing a comforting hand on Lily's back. Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, she said softly. And sometimes, they don't know the right thing to do until later. Lily seemed to consider that for a moment before glancing at Sophie. Do you think he's nice? Sophie shrugged. I don't know. Maybe. Evan almost laughed, but he held it back. He wasn't expecting them to accept him right away. They didn't know him, and he had no right to expect them to. But he was here now, and he was going to prove that he wasn't going anywhere. Selina straightened, giving him a small nod. Why don't we go inside? Evan followed them into the house. It was warm, cozy, filled with little signs of a life he had missed, children's drawings pinned to the fridge, tiny shoes lined up by the door, stuffed animals on the couch. It wasn't the cold luxury of his penthouse. It was something else entirely. Something that felt like home. Selina led them to the living room, where a few toys were scattered on the floor. The girls climbed onto the couch, sitting close together as they watched him with cautious interest. He took a seat in the armchair across from them, feeling like he was being evaluated. Sophie pointed at his wrist. What's that? Evan glanced down at his watch. It's a watch. Sophie frowned. It's very shiny. Lily nudged her. Maybe he's rich. Selina let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Girls, we talked about this. Evan smiled slightly. It's okay. And yes, I guess you could say that. Sophie's eyes widened. Do you have a big house? I do. Lily crossed her arms. Bigger than this one? Yes. She seemed unimpressed. Do you have a dog? Evan hesitated. No. Lily turned to Sophie. Then I don't think it's that great. Selina covered her mouth to stifle a laugh, and Evan couldn't help but smile. He had no idea what he was doing, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And that was a start. Evan sat in the armchair, watching as Lily and Sophie continued to eye him with cautious curiosity. He had expected some kind of emotional moment, perhaps excitement, or even immediate rejection. But instead, they were simply observing him, trying to figure out who he was and where he fit into their world. And he couldn't blame them. For 5 years, he had been nothing more than a stranger. They had grown up without him, built a life without knowing he existed. Now, in the span of a single day, he had gone from a nameless face to something more. Something they didn't quite understand yet. Selina sat on the couch beside the girls, her presence a quiet reassurance for them. She didn't push, didn't try to force a connection, and for that, he was grateful. Sophie was the first to break the silence. If you're my dad, does that mean you have to be here all the time now? Evan glanced at Selina before answering. I'd like to be here as much as you want me to be. Lily narrowed her eyes slightly, as if trying to catch him in a lie. But you weren't here before. Evan took a slow breath. No, I wasn't. And I wish I had been. Lily tilted her head. Why weren't you? Selina shifted slightly, ready to step in, but Evan raised a hand. He needed to answer this himself. Because I didn't know, he admitted. Your mom didn't tell me. Sophie frowned. Why not? Selina cleared her throat. Because I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do at the time. Lily turned back to Evan. And now? Evan met her gaze, steady and certain. Now, I want to be here. I want to know you both. And I want you to know me. The room was silent for a moment as the girls processed his words. Sophie swung her legs over the edge of the couch, studying him. Do you like ice cream? Evan blinked at the sudden change in topic. Yeah, I do. Sophie nodded as if this were a crucial detail. What kind? Vanilla. Lily made a face. That's boring. Evan chuckled. What do you like? Chocolate chip cookie dough, Lily declared. Strawberry, Sophie added. Evan nodded seriously. Those are good choices. Sophie seemed satisfied with that answer and leaned toward Lily. He's not that bad. Lily sighed, crossing her arms. I guess. Evan looked at Selina, and she gave him a small, knowing smile. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Would you girls want to go out for ice cream sometime? He asked. Sophie's eyes lit up immediately, but she turned to Lily, waiting for her reaction. Lily hesitated, her fingers tapping against the fabric of the couch. Finally, she shrugged. Maybe. Evan smiled. I'll take that as a yes. For the first time, the tension in the room seemed to lift just a little. The girls weren't ready to call him Dad or trust him completely, but they were giving him a chance. And right now, that was more than enough. A few days later, Evan found himself standing outside a small ice cream shop, waiting as Selina helped the girls decide on their flavors. It was a cozy little place, far from the high-end restaurants and exclusive venues he was used to, but there was something about the simplicity of it that felt right. Lily and Sophie stood in front of the glass display case, their small faces pressed close as they examined the rows of colorful ice cream. Sophie was bouncing slightly on her toes, clearly excited, while Lily took her time, carefully considering her options. Selina turned to Evan with an amused expression. They take their ice cream decisions very seriously. Evan smirked. I can see that. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie finally made her decision. Strawberry with sprinkles. The teenage employee behind the counter smiled and scooped her order into a cone before handing it to her. Sophie took it carefully, beaming. Lily, still deep in thought, finally nodded. Chocolate chip cookie dough. Evan wasn't surprised. She had been very clear about her favorite flavor the last time they spoke. Once everyone had their ice cream, they found a small table outside, shaded by a large umbrella. The girls climbed into their seats, swinging their legs as they enjoyed their treats. Evan took a small bite of his vanilla cone and caught Sophie watching him with a thoughtful expression. Do you always wear suits? She asked, tilting her head. Evan glanced down at his neatly pressed navy blue suit and smiled. Pretty much. Even when you eat ice cream? She asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Even then. Lily scrunched her nose. That's weird. Selina chuckled, shaking her head. I told you he was fancy. Sophie took another bite of her ice cream, then pointed at Evan's wrist. You still have that shiny watch. It's called a Rolex, Lily corrected her. Evan raised an eyebrow. You know what a Rolex is? Lily shrugged. I watch shows. Sophie giggled, clearly entertained by her sister's confidence. Evan leaned forward slightly. So, what else do you two like to do besides eating ice cream? Sophie perked up immediately. I like to draw. And dance. And I want to be a ballerina when I grow up. That's impressive, Evan said genuinely. Do you take lessons? She nodded enthusiastically. Mom takes me every Saturday. Evan made a mental note of that. Lily, on the other hand, was more reserved. She licked her ice cream slowly, staring at her cone as if it held all the answers in the world. What about you, Lily? Evan prompted gently. She hesitated, then shrugged. I like books. Selina smiled. She loves stories. She's always reading something new. Evan's interest piqued. What's your favorite book? Lily finally looked up at him. I like adventure stories. Evan nodded, taking that in. I'll have to find a good one for you sometime. Lily studied him for a moment, then slowly nodded. Sophie, meanwhile, had already moved on to another topic. Mom said you have a big house, she said between bites. Like, a really big house. Evan chuckled. I do. Does it have a pool? Yes. Her eyes widened. Can we see it? Selina gave her a look. Sophie. Sophie pouted. What? I just want to know. Evan smiled slightly. Maybe one day. That seemed to satisfy her, and she went back to her ice cream. As Evan sat there, watching the two little girls, his daughters, he realized just how much he had missed. Every small moment, every simple joy, every little question they asked. But he was here now. And he was going to make sure he never missed another moment again. Evan had always been a man of control. In business, in life, in every decision he made, he ensured that nothing was left to chance. But nothing about this situation was within his control. It had been weeks since he met Lily and Sophie, and slowly, little by little, they were letting him in. Sophie was the more open of the two, always asking questions, always eager to learn more about him. Lily, however, was still hesitant. She was observant, careful, and seemed to be waiting for him to prove himself in a way she hadn't voiced yet. He didn't blame her. She had spent 5 years without him. She had no reason to believe that he would stay. That was why, when Selina invited him over for dinner one evening, he didn't hesitate. He wanted to be there. He wanted to be a part of their world, not just a visitor passing through. When he arrived, the smell of something warm and familiar greeted him at the door. He had never been in Selina's home before, but it felt like her. Cozy, inviting, filled with small details that told a story about who she had become over the years. The girls were in the living room, sitting on the floor with a pile of books spread out in front of them. Sophie looked up first and grinned. You're here. Evan smiled. I said I would be. Lily glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to her book. Selina walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Dinner's almost ready, she said, offering him a small smile. I hope you like homemade lasagna. Evan chuckled. I'll eat anything that's not from a business dinner. Sophie hopped up and grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the couch. You have to see this book. It has dragons and princesses and everything. Evan let her drag him to the floor, where she plopped down and flipped through the pages eagerly. Lily, however, kept her distance, her book still open on her lap. What are you reading? Evan asked, turning toward her. She hesitated before holding up the cover. It was a classic adventure novel, something he himself had read as a child. That's a great one, he said. I used to love that book. Lily glanced up at him. You read it? He nodded. More than once. The best part is toward the end. She narrowed her eyes slightly. No spoilers. Evan raised his hands in surrender. Wouldn't dream of it. For the first time, a small smile flickered on her lips before she looked back down at the pages. Selina called them to the table a few minutes later, and to Evan's surprise, the evening felt almost normal. They talked. They laughed. Sophie chattered about her ballet class. Lily shared a random fact about the book she was reading. Selina rolled her eyes when Evan teased her about her cooking skills, but there was warmth behind it. And then, after dinner, as Evan was helping clear the table, Lily suddenly spoke. Are you going to stay? The question caught him off guard. He turned to find her standing near the doorway, her small fingers twisting in the hem of her dress. Stay tonight? He asked carefully. She shook her head. No. Stay forever. Evan's throat tightened. He looked at Selina, who was watching quietly, not stepping in this time. This was between him and Lily. He crouched down so they were at eye level. I want to, he said honestly. More than anything. Lily studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his. People leave, she finally said. His chest ached at those words. I won't, he promised. She hesitated, then slowly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. It wasn't tight. It wasn't desperate. But it was something. Evan closed his eyes for a brief second, letting himself take in the weight of the moment. He had spent his life building walls, making sure no one could hurt him. But right now, with his daughter's arms around him, he realized something. He wasn't afraid of being vulnerable anymore. Because for the first time in years, he had something worth holding on to. Evan had always thought success was measured by numbers, the size of his company, the wealth he accumulated, the power he held in every boardroom. But as he stood in the middle of Selina's living room, watching his daughters argue over what movie to watch, he realized that this was what mattered. It had been a month since that dinner, and everything had changed. Slowly, carefully, he had become a part of their world, not just a visitor but someone they expected to be there. He had rearranged his schedule, cut back on the late-night meetings, and spent more time here, where he wanted to be. Tonight, he had promised them a movie night. Selina sat on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, watching as Sophie and Lily engaged in a heated debate. I picked last time, Sophie insisted, her arms crossed. No, you didn't, Lily argued. You picked the week before. It's my turn. Sophie pouted and turned to Evan. Dad, tell her I should pick. Evan froze for a second. She had called him Dad. It wasn't the first time, but every time it happened, it hit him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He met Selina's gaze, and she smiled softly before turning back to the girls. Well, he said, clearing his throat. What if we do both movies? One tonight, one tomorrow. Lily narrowed her eyes. What if you fall asleep? I don't fall asleep during movies. Selina snorted. That is a lie. Sophie giggled, and Lily smirked. Okay, but if you fall asleep, we pick the movie tomorrow. Deal, Evan said, holding out his hand. Lily shook it, satisfied. A few minutes later, they were all settled on the couch. Sophie curled up beside Selina, and Lily sat next to Evan, her legs tucked under a blanket. It was casual, easy, something he never would have imagined himself doing a year ago. Halfway through the movie, Lily's head slowly tilted onto his shoulder. He didn't move, barely even breathed, afraid that if he did, she would pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she sighed softly, like she had been holding in something for a long time. Evan glanced at Selina, who was watching with a quiet smile. She mouthed, "You're doing good." For the first time in his life, Evan believed that. It wasn't perfect. There were still things to figure out. But he had his daughters, and they had him. And he wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The ending of this story is deeply emotional and fulfilling, not because everything is magically perfect, but because it feels earned. Evan begins as a man who believes he has lost everything that ever mattered, convincing himself that success is enough. But when he discovers the truth, that he has two daughters he never knew about, his entire world shifts. What makes this ending so powerful is that it doesn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. Instead, it focuses on small moments, Lily resting her head on his shoulder, Sophie calling him Dad for the first time, Selina giving him a look that says she finally trusts him. These quiet, intimate moments show real growth, real change. Evan doesn't get back the 6 years he lost, and he knows he never will. But he chooses to be present now, to stay, to prove to his daughters that he is someone they can rely on. The fact that Lily, the more cautious and guarded of the two, finally lets her guard down in the end is the clearest sign that he has truly become part of their lives. There's also an unspoken hope in his relationship with Selena. The story doesn't force a perfect romantic resolution, but it leaves room for something more. It suggests that healing is happening, that trust is being rebuilt, not just between Evan and his daughters, but between him and Selena as well. This isn't just a story about a man finding out he's a father. It's a story about earning the right to be one. About learning that love isn't about obligation, it's about showing up, every day, no matter what. And that's what makes this ending so satisfying. It's not just happy, it's deserved. Garrett Hale was used to power, control, and predictability. Nothing in his world ever caught him off guard. Until two identical 6-year-old girls appeared in front of him, their wide blue eyes locking onto his. "Sir, we're lost," one of them said. The other nodded. "And we were looking for you." Garrett froze, his mind racing. Looking for him? Before he could process what was happening, he found himself exhaling sharply. "All right," he muttered. "Let's figure this out." Garrett Hale moved quickly down the sidewalk, his eyes focused ahead as he checked his watch. He was late for a meeting, something that almost never happened. His life was built on discipline and control, and lateness was a weakness he didn't tolerate, especially in himself. His driver was already waiting by the curb, the sleek black car gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Just as he reached for the door handle, a small voice stopped him. "Sir." Garrett turned sharply, frowning. Standing just a few feet away were two little girls, no older than 6. They had identical dark curls framing their small faces, and their striking blue eyes, unmistakably the same shade as his own, stared up at him with a mix of uncertainty and determination. His first instinct was to glance around, searching for a frantic parent or guardian, but the sidewalk was mostly empty. The girls were alone. "Are you lost?" he asked, keeping his voice even. One of them hesitated, biting her lip before shaking her head. The other, who looked slightly more confident, took a step forward. "We were looking for you." Garrett stiffened, his grip on the car door tightening. That was not an answer he had expected. "You were looking for me," he repeated, his voice measured. Both girls nodded at the same time. Garrett felt a strange unease settle in his chest. Children didn't just go searching for corporate CEOs. Something about this wasn't right. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The Boulder twin hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "At home." Garrett narrowed his eyes. "Do they know you're here?" This time, the answer didn't come as quickly. The quieter twin shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her small backpack. The slight guilt on her face told him everything he needed to know. "No," she admitted softly. Garrett exhaled slowly, glancing between the two of them. They didn't seem scared, which only added to the strangeness of the situation. If they weren't lost, and if their parents didn't know they were here, then why had they come? "And why exactly were you looking for me?" he asked, crossing his arms. The girls exchanged a glance. The one who had spoken more pulled something out of her backpack and held it out to him. It was an old photograph. Garrett took it, his breath catching in his throat as his gaze fell on the image. It was him. Younger, dressed in a casual button-down shirt, standing beside a woman with soft brown eyes and dark curls. He knew this picture. He knew her. Mallory Carter. A name he hadn't thought about in years. His eyes flicked back to the twins, something cold running down his spine. "She's our mom," the girl said quietly. Garrett's pulse pounded in his ears. He looked down at the photograph again, then back at the two little girls with identical blue eyes. For the first time in years, Garrett Hale had no idea what to say. Garrett stared at the photograph in his hand, his fingers tightening around the worn edges. The image was slightly faded, but there was no mistaking the two people in it, him and Mallory. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't even thought about her in a long time. Yet here he was, standing on a busy sidewalk, confronted by two little girls who claimed she was their mother. His mind raced through the possibilities, searching for an explanation that made sense. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong person. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. But as he looked at them again, those wide blue eyes staring up at him with quiet anticipation, he knew deep down that it wasn't a mistake at all. "Where is your mother now?" he asked, his voice controlled, but not as steady as usual. "At home," the bolder twin said. "She doesn't know we're here." Garrett felt something shift inside him. "You ran away?" The quieter girl hesitated before nodding. "We wanted to find you." His grip on the photo tightened as he processed their words. Mallory hadn't sent them. They had come on their own, which meant she either hadn't told them about him or hadn't expected them to ever meet him. Either way, they had found him, and now he had two 6-year-old girls standing in front of him, expecting something from him that he wasn't sure he could give. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, running a hand through his dark curls. He wasn't used to dealing with children, let alone two who had tracked him down like this. "Your mother must be worried sick." The first twin, Lily, as he later learned, shifted slightly. "We thought she wouldn't notice." Garrett let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had built his life on structure, control, and calculated decisions. Nothing in his world was ever left to chance. But this? Two little girls showing up out of nowhere with eyes that mirrored his own. This wasn't something he could have planned for. "How did you even find me?" he finally asked. Sophie, the quieter twin, pulled something else from her backpack, a piece of paper folded several times. She handed it to him, and as he unfolded it, he immediately recognized what it was. A printed copy of his company's address. Garrett frowned. "Where did you get this?" "In a box in Mom's closet," Lily admitted. "She had some letters and papers. We saw your name and looked it up." Garrett inhaled deeply, trying to contain the growing frustration inside him. They had gone through Mallory's things, found his name, and somehow managed to make their way here without her knowing. That alone was reckless. But what weighed on him more heavily was the fact that Mallory had clearly kept traces of him in her life, even if she had never reached out. "You should have told her where you were going," he said finally. "We didn't think you'd be mad," Sophie said, looking at him with a slight frown. "We just wanted to know who you were." Her words cut deeper than he expected. Garrett had spent years avoiding connections, avoiding anything that tied him down. He had never considered what might have happened after he and Mallory went their separate ways. He had never once thought that there could be two little girls growing up without knowing who he was. And now they were here. "You know now," he said, his voice quieter. "What happens next?" The girls looked at each other, then back at him. "Can we talk to Mom first?" Lily asked. Garrett exhaled. That was the only thing that made sense. He couldn't stand here on a sidewalk with two lost children and pretend he knew what to do next. "Get in the car," he said, nodding toward his sleek black vehicle. "I'm taking you home." As they climbed in, Garrett sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had come here today expecting a routine business meeting. Instead, he was driving two little girls, his daughters, to a woman he hadn't seen in almost 7 years. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of that door. The drive to the girls' home was quiet, but not the kind of comfortable silence Garrett was used to. This silence felt heavy, loaded with questions he wasn't ready to ask and answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Lily and Sophie sat in the back seat, their small bodies barely filling the luxurious leather seats of his car. They weren't scared, which surprised him. If anything, they seemed expectant. As if they had known all along that he would take them home. Garrett's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he turned onto a familiar street. He hadn't been here in years, but everything looked the same. The row of townhouses, the tree-lined sidewalk, the small neighborhood park at the end of the block, it all felt like a place frozen in time. He pulled up to a modest but well-kept house and parked in the driveway. The moment he shut off the engine, the front door burst open. Mallory stood on the porch, her dark brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face pale with worry. The instant she spotted the twins in the back seat, her expression shifted from fear to relief, then to something much sharper, anger. Before Garrett could even step out of the car, she was already moving toward them, her footsteps quick and full of purpose. Lily. Sophie. Her voice was breathless, desperate. What were you thinking? Both girls scrambled out of the car as soon as Garrett unlocked the doors. They ran to their mother, their heads ducked in guilt as she pulled them into a tight hug. "We're sorry, Mom," Sophie mumbled against her shoulder. "We just wanted to see him," Lily added softly. Mallory squeezed them tighter before pulling back, her hands gripping their arms gently but firmly. "You scared me half to death," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't just run off like that." Garrett stood beside his car, watching the scene unfold. He had prepared himself for anger, for accusations, but he hadn't been ready for the raw emotion in Mallory's eyes when she looked at her daughters. Finally, she straightened, her gaze snapping to him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Garrett met her eyes, keeping his voice even. "They came to find me. I brought them home." Mallory exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. "Of course they did." She turned back to the girls. "Go inside. Now." Lily and Sophie hesitated, casting a glance at Garrett before nodding. They walked toward the house, their heads down, leaving the two adults standing in tense silence. Once the front door closed behind them, Mallory crossed her arms. "So," she said, her voice low and controlled. "Now you know." Garrett nodded slowly. "Yeah. Now I know." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Took you long enough." His jaw clenched. "You never told me, Mallory." Her expression hardened. Would it have made a difference? Garrett didn't have an answer to that. And the fact that he didn't frustrated him more than anything. Mallory sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "Look, I don't want to do this out here. Come inside." He hesitated for a second before following her up the steps. The inside of the house was warm, lived in. It wasn't big, but it was full of life, children's drawings pinned to the fridge, a basket of laundry sitting by the couch, a few toys scattered near the stairs. It smelled like cinnamon and something vaguely floral, a scent that was familiar in a way that made something in his chest tighten. Mallory gestured toward the kitchen. "Sit." Garrett pulled out a chair at the small wooden table, watching as she poured herself a cup of coffee before turning to him. "You want one?" she asked. "No." She shrugged, taking a sip before sitting across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Mallory set her cup down and looked him in the eye. "I never planned on you finding out." Garrett exhaled slowly. "Why?" She let out a humorless chuckle. "You're really asking me that?" "Yes, Mallory, I am," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You had to know I would have wanted to know." She stared at him for a long time before answering. "When I found out I was pregnant, I thought about telling you," she admitted. "I really did. But you were already gone, Garrett. You were moving up in the world, making your name. And I knew what would happen if I told you." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "You would have felt obligated," she said simply. "Not because you wanted to, but because it was the right thing to do. And I didn't want that." I didn't want you in their life out of duty. I wanted you in their life because you wanted to be there. Garrett clenched his jaw. That wasn't your decision to make. Maybe not, Mallory admitted. But I made it anyway. Silence settled between them again, heavier this time. Garrett glanced toward the living room, where he could hear the faint sound of the girls talking upstairs. His daughters. I want to be in their lives, he said finally. Mallory studied him carefully. Why now? Because I should have been there from the beginning, he said. And because they came looking for me. That has to mean something. She looked down at her coffee cup, tracing the rim with her finger. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. They've always wondered about you, she admitted. I never lied to them. I just, never gave them answers. And I think that only made them more curious. Garrett nodded slowly. Mallory took a deep breath. All right, she said. If you really want to be in their lives, then prove it. His gaze sharpened. How? She gave him a small, tired smile. Show up. It was the simplest challenge, but somehow, it felt like the hardest one. Garrett had spent years showing up for meetings, for business deals, for contracts worth millions. But this? This was different. This time, he wasn't just proving himself to a boardroom. He was proving himself to them. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, but Garrett's mind was anything but. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched as he replayed everything Mallory had said. She had kept them from him. His daughters. The anger he had felt in her kitchen still lingered, simmering just below the surface. But beneath it, there was something else. Something deeper. Guilt. Because no matter how much he wanted to be furious with Mallory, he couldn't ignore the truth. She had been right about one thing. Back then, he wouldn't have known what to do. He had been too focused on his career, too obsessed with proving himself in the corporate world. If she had told him, would he have made the right choice? He didn't know. And that uncertainty was worse than the anger. When he finally pulled into the underground parking garage of his building, he let out a slow breath, trying to clear his thoughts. He stepped out of the car and headed straight for the elevator, barely acknowledging the doorman who greeted him. His penthouse was just as he had left it, pristine, silent, untouched. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline in the distance, the twinkling lights of skyscrapers stretching endlessly beyond the glass. It was the kind of view people dreamed of. But right now, it just felt empty. He walked toward the bar and poured himself a glass of whiskey, taking a slow sip as he stared out at the city. His mind drifted back to earlier that evening. The way Lily and Sophie had looked at him when they asked who he was. The way they had clung to Mallory when they realized she was upset. They weren't just two random children. They were his. His daughters. The thought sent a strange, unfamiliar sensation through him. It was different from business, from deals, from anything he had ever handled before. It wasn't something he could strategize his way through. He had spent years making decisions that shaped entire industries, but he had never made a decision as important as this. Could he do this? Would they even want him to? The sharp buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen. Mallory. He hesitated for only a second before answering. Yeah. There was a pause on the other end before she spoke. The girls won't stop talking about you. Garrett exhaled, running a hand through his curls. Is that a good thing? Mallory let out a soft laugh, but there was something tired beneath it. I don't know yet. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she sighed. Look. I know today was a lot. For all of us. But if you're serious about being in their lives, I need to know that you're really going to be there. Not just today. Not just when it's convenient. Garrett leaned against the counter, staring at the dark liquid in his glass. I meant what I said, he replied. I want to be there. There was another pause, then a quieter voice. Then prove it. Garrett frowned slightly. How? Come back tomorrow, Mallory said simply. Spend time with them. Get to know them. He inhaled slowly, then nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Okay. Okay, she echoed. Then I'll see you tomorrow. She ended the call before he could say anything else. Garrett set his phone down and took another slow sip of whiskey. For the first time in his life, he was stepping into something he couldn't control. Something uncertain. Something messy. But for some reason, it didn't scare him as much as it should have. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals or profits or power. He was thinking about them. Garrett arrived at Mallory's house the next afternoon, earlier than he had planned. He sat in his car for a few moments, staring at the front door, trying to ignore the unusual weight pressing down on his chest. He had walked into boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, negotiated billion-dollar deals with men who would sell their own families for profit, and yet, nothing had ever made him feel as unprepared as this. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and made his way to the porch. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Lily stood there, blinking up at him, surprise flickering across her face. You're here. Garrett arched an eyebrow. You sound like you weren't expecting me. She shrugged. Mom said you would come, but Sophie said you might change your mind. Something about that struck a nerve. And what did you think? Lily tilted her head, considering. I thought if you really wanted to be here, you'd come early. Garrett smirked slightly. Then I guess I passed the test. Before she could say anything else, Sophie appeared behind her. She stared at him for a moment, then turned her head slightly. Mom, he's actually here. Mallory's voice drifted in from the kitchen. Let him in before you keep making announcements, Sophie. The twins stepped aside, and Garrett walked in, feeling the warmth of the house settle around him. The smell of something sweet lingered in the air, like cinnamon and vanilla. The living room was tidy but lived in, filled with small details that made it feel like a home, picture frames on the shelves, a blanket draped over the couch, a few scattered toys near the staircase. It was nothing like the cold, minimalist penthouse he returned to every night. Mallory emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She glanced at the clock before giving him an approving look. You're early. Garrett shrugged. Lily said that was the only way to prove I wanted to be here. Mallory smiled faintly, shaking her head. They're tougher than they look. Lily grinned. We get it from Mom. Mallory rolled her eyes. All right, enough ganging up on him. You two go get your coats. We're going out. Garrett raised an eyebrow. We are. Mallory nodded. I figured if you're serious about getting to know them, sitting awkwardly in my living room isn't the best way to do it. He couldn't argue with that. A few minutes later, they were in his car, heading toward the park. The girls chattered in the back seat, sometimes to him, sometimes to each other, filling the silence in a way that was surprisingly comfortable. So, you're rich, right? Sophie asked suddenly. Garrett glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Something like that. Lily leaned forward slightly. How rich? Mallory sighed. Girls. What? Lily said innocently. It's a fair question. Garrett smirked. Rich enough. Sophie squinted at him. Like, rich enough to have a pet tiger. Garrett chuckled. Why would I need a tiger? Lily shrugged. Because you're a CEO. CEOs do weird things sometimes. Mallory groaned. Please don't assume every CEO is a lunatic. Sophie crossed her arms. Then what's the point of being rich if you don't have something cool? Garrett thought for a moment. I have a plane. The twins exchanged wide-eyed glances. "You have a plane?" Lily asked. Garrett nodded. "And a helicopter?" Sophie's mouth dropped open. "Can we ride in it?" Mallory turned in her seat. "Absolutely not." Garrett smirked. "Maybe someday." The twins whispered excitedly to each other as Mallory shot him a warning glare. He just shrugged, amused by how quickly they had latched onto the idea. At the park, the girls ran ahead, their laughter filling the crisp autumn air. Garrett stood beside Mallory, watching them climb onto the swings. "They like you," she said after a moment. Garrett glanced at her. "Yeah." Mallory nodded. "But they don't trust easily. If you're going to be in their lives, don't make promises you can't keep." Garrett's jaw tightened. "I don't break promises." Mallory studied him, as if trying to decide if she could believe that. After a long pause, she nodded. "Good." They stood in silence, watching as Sophie leaped off the swing with a triumphant laugh, followed quickly by Lily. For the first time in years, Garrett felt something shift inside him. And for once, he wasn't afraid of it. The days that followed were unlike anything Garrett had experienced before. His usual routine, structured, disciplined, and predictable, had been disrupted by two small forces of nature named Lily and Sophie. Instead of back-to-back meetings and business negotiations, he now found himself answering rapid-fire questions about everything from his favorite food to whether or not he had ever fought a shark. He had expected them to be distant, hesitant around him, but that wasn't how they worked. They were careful at first, studying him the way one might examine something unfamiliar, but once they decided he wasn't going anywhere, they wasted no time in making him part of their world. It was overwhelming. And strangely, he didn't mind. On the fourth day, Mallory called him. He had just finished reviewing a contract when he picked up, leaning back in his office chair. "They won't stop asking when you're coming back," she said before he could even greet her. Garrett smirked, glancing at the clock. "Miss me already?" Mallory snorted. "Not me. Them." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I'll be there in an hour." When he arrived at the house, the front door opened before he could even knock. Lily and Sophie barreled out, their faces lighting up as they grabbed his hands. "Mom said we could go get ice cream," Sophie announced. "Can we?" Lily asked, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "You do realize it's almost dinner time, right?" Lily nodded solemnly. "That's why we have to go before Mom changes her mind." Mallory appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "I never agreed to before dinner." Lily and Sophie turned identical pleading gazes on their mother, eyes wide with dramatic innocence. Mallory sighed. "Fine. But small portions." The girls cheered as Garrett led them to the car. The drive was filled with endless chatter, with Lily and Sophie debating over what flavors were the best. "Chocolate is obviously the best," Lily declared. "That's so basic," Sophie argued. "Mint chocolate chip is better." Garrett smirked. "You know, I'm more of a vanilla guy myself." Both girls gasped in exaggerated horror. Mallory, from the passenger seat, shook her head. "And you want to be a part of their lives?" Garrett laughed, something that still felt strange coming so naturally. "Guess I'll have to work on my taste." At the ice cream shop, the girls wasted no time picking their flavors. As they ate, Sophie suddenly looked up at him, her expression more serious than usual. "Are you gonna be here for our birthday?" The question caught him off guard. "When's your birthday?" "Next month," Lily said, licking her spoon. Garrett glanced at Mallory, who was watching him carefully. He looked back at the twins. "Of course, I'll be here." Sophie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay." Garrett wasn't sure why, but that single word felt like more than just an acknowledgement. It felt like a test. One he wasn't going to fail. A week passed, and Garrett found himself slipping into a new rhythm, one that felt completely foreign yet oddly natural at the same time. His life had always been structured, controlled, every moment accounted for. But now, his days were interrupted by excited phone calls from Lily and Sophie, invitations to come over, and the expectation that he would actually show up. And he did. At first, he had assumed the twins would treat him like a guest in their lives, someone new and unfamiliar, but they had no hesitation in pulling him directly into their world. They had opinions about everything: what kind of shoes he should wear, what movies he needed to watch, and even how he should style his hair. He had expected it to be exhausting. Instead, it was grounding. One evening, as he sat in Mallory's kitchen, watching Lily and Sophie attempt to teach him how to braid hair using one of their dolls, he realized something unsettling. He didn't want this to be temporary. He had spent his entire life believing that work was the most important thing, that love and family were distractions, that emotions only made a man weak. But sitting here, with two 6-year-olds laughing at his failed attempt to braid synthetic blonde strands, he couldn't remember why he had ever thought that. Mallory leaned against the counter, watching the scene with an amused expression. "They've got you wrapped around their little fingers." Garrett glanced up, smirking. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sophie lifted her head. "He's actually not that bad at braiding." Lily nodded. "Yeah, for a beginner." Mallory shook her head. "They're just being nice. That braid is a disaster." Garrett sighed, setting the doll down. "Fine. I accept defeat." Sophie grinned. "You'll get better with practice." The thought settled into his chest, warm and unfamiliar. After the girls had gone to bed, Garrett stayed behind. Mallory handed him a cup of tea, something she had always done when they were together, back when things were simpler. He held the cup between his hands, studying her carefully. "You're letting me in," he said after a moment. Mallory exhaled, crossing her arms. "I guess I am." "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "Because I see the way they look at you. They like having you around." She glanced toward the hallway where the twins' bedroom was. "And I think they need you." Garrett swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. "And what about you?" Mallory let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know yet." He nodded, setting his cup down. "That's fair." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them no longer as tense as it had been weeks ago. Mallory finally sighed. "You're really staying, aren't you?" Garrett met her gaze. "Yeah. I am." For the first time, she didn't challenge him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for an escape. Garrett had never imagined that a single moment could shift the course of his life so completely. He had spent years believing that control and precision were the keys to success, that emotions were liabilities, and that family was a distraction. But now, as he stood in Mallory's kitchen again, helping Lily and Sophie decorate cupcakes for their upcoming birthday, he realized how wrong he had been. The kitchen was filled with laughter and the scent of vanilla. The twins were covered in flour and frosting, their small hands making a mess of the counter as they carefully placed colorful sprinkles on top of the cupcakes. Garrett had tried to help, but after smudging blue icing on Sophie's nose and earning himself a scolding from Lily for ruining the aesthetic, he had been demoted to cleanup duty. "You're taking this very seriously," Garrett said, watching Lily examine a cupcake as if she were judging a 5-star meal. "It has to be perfect," she said, adjusting the sprinkles with a careful hand. "It's our birthday." Sophie licked frosting off her fingers. "I think they look fine." "Fine isn't good enough," Lily muttered. Garrett smirked. "Sounds like someone I know." Mallory, who had been watching from across the kitchen, raised an eyebrow. "Wonder where she gets that from." Lily and Sophie finished their cupcakes and hopped down from their stools, satisfied with their work. Can we show them to Mom? Lily asked. Garrett nodded. Go ahead. The girls ran off, their laughter trailing behind them. As soon as they were out of sight, Mallory turned to Garrett, crossing her arms. So, birthday presents. Garrett leaned against the counter. What about them? Mallory gave him a look. You're planning on spoiling them, aren't you? Garrett smirked. I don't know what you're talking about. Garrett. He sighed, lifting his hands in surrender. Fine. I may have gone a little overboard. Mallory rolled her eyes. How overboard? Let's just say, there may be a pony involved. She groaned. You bought them a pony? Garrett smirked. Technically, I haven't bought it yet. Mallory covered her face with her hands. I can't believe this. They deserve something special, he said, his voice softer now. Mallory dropped her hands and met his gaze. They don't need grand gestures, Garrett. They need you. He held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. After a long pause, he nodded. I know. Mallory sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway where the girls had disappeared. They really love having you here, you know. Garrett swallowed. I love being here. Mallory hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small smile. Then stay. Garrett didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. Because in his heart, he already knew. He wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. This story is more than just a tale about a billionaire discovering he has children. It's about responsibility, redemption, and the realization that true success isn't measured in wealth but in the relationships we build. Garrett starts as a man who believes he has control over everything, his career, his emotions, his future. But the arrival of Lily and Sophie challenges everything he thought he knew. At first, he struggles, unsure of how to fit into their world. Yet, as the story unfolds, he realizes that being a father isn't about grand gestures or financial security, it's about showing up. Lily and Sophie, despite their young age, are not just passive characters in his transformation. They are the ones who push him to grow, who demand honesty and presence. Their innocence and curiosity force Garrett to confront the choices he's made and the life he's been avoiding. Mallory, too, represents a crucial part of his journey. She isn't just the mother of his children, she is a reminder of who he used to be and a challenge to who he can become. Her reluctance to let him back into their lives isn't about resentment, it's about protecting the daughters she raised alone. The beauty of the ending isn't in perfection but in progress. Garrett doesn't suddenly become the perfect father overnight, nor does Mallory immediately trust him. But what makes the ending powerful is that he chooses to stay. He chooses to show up, day after day, proving not just to Mallory and the girls, but to himself, that he wants to be part of this family. The final moment, where he realizes he's not just someone passing through their lives but someone who belongs there, is what makes the story truly meaningful. Because, in the end, Garrett Hale doesn't just gain daughters, he gains a reason to live beyond his empire.